We're good? Yep. You just hit fade, Yep. All right. Good afternoon. We're going to open with a word of prayer. Father, we come before you. We thank you for this day. We thank you for the rain that's come through. I pray for safety for everyone in our area as the winds were strong and as the storm blew through quickly. But we thank you for the water that comes to bring life. We thank you for the life that you've injected into our community and the lives that come together to worship you, to honor you, and to learn more about you. I pray that this study that we're embarking on with the book of Micah will encourage us and keep us continuing on our path and help us direct others towards you. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen. Amen. All right, well, I know Tommy told us he read a little bit ahead of time. Anybody else read a little bit ahead of time? Read up on the background or anything? No? So, no, it's okay. And it's a lot of information for the background, so I know Tommy will give his comments too, but it may be good for this week, and then I can kind of lay out the background, and then we can kind of go forward from that next week, starting in chapter 1, so everybody can read ahead each chapter every week, and then just kind of go from there. So today, this week is really just to be the introduction to Micah, to do like we studied with the How to Study the Bible course, that we would approach every book that we approach in the Bible with a way that we know that's going to give us the best benefit to understand what God truly intended and how we should understand it. So with that, we'll kind of dig in just like we did with Jonah before and start with the introduction to the background of Micah. So what does Micah's name mean? Anybody know? Who is like Yahweh? Or who is like Yah, Micah, but who is like Yah or Yahweh? Who is like God? And what do we know about Micah? Do we know anything? What are some things we know about Micah from the book? If anybody knows. Wait, what now? Sixth of the minor prophets. It's one of the 12, book of the 12, the minor prophets. We know his name, right? We know that his name is Micah. What else do we know? That he's connected to a place. What's the name of the place? Moresheth. We have a general time frame. How do we know the general time frame? Or at least a general time frame. We'll talk about that a little bit. There we go. Verse 1, he was in the days of 3 different kings, right? So when we see these things, it helps us kind of understand the time frame that's intended by the book, and hopefully the time frame that's intended by his audience or his prophecy. So who's the audience? These are just some things from verse 1. I should have said verse 1. But who's the audience of Micah's prophecies? Us, obviously, but we're reading here, but in the book itself. What's Samaria and Jerusalem? Or we could really say the whole of Israel. At this time, we know that Israel's broken up into 2 different nations, really. You have Israel and Judah. They've been divided. The northern tribes are referred to as Israel or Jacob or Ephraim at times. The southern tribes called Judah, sometimes called Israel as a whole as well. But we have this divided kingdom of Israel that's happening. And so when it says Samaria and Jerusalem, generally referring to the northern tribes, southern tribes, or the Israel and Judah. Is Micah a prophet? How do we know? How do we know Micah's a prophet?
That which he spoke of came to pass.
What he spoke of came to pass. And what's a prophet? Anybody remember our definition of a prophet from like Jonah? The Navi. What's that? The mouthpiece of God, right? God spoke through him, and what he said came to pass. But the book, interestingly, never calls him a prophet. Something to understand going forward. Not that it means he's not a prophet, but it's just interesting that a lot of the other prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Isaiah, some of these bigger prophets, even I think Malachi even does, and we talked about Jonah. Jonah is never called a prophet in the book of Jonah, and you can kind of put these 2 side to side and almost have a dichotomy of a good prophet and a bad prophet. Neither one are called a prophet. Both are to act on behalf of God in the role of a prophet. And so we'll see the difference between Micah and Jonah. So what can we infer by the fact that he's never called a prophet? Or what could we possibly infer from that? I would suggest maybe it might not be his sole vocation, right? It may not be the sole thing that he does. Can God give you a gift to do something that's outside of your normal vocation every single day? Yeah, so I think maybe that's possible. That's kind of like the big theme that people have with this idea that he's never named a prophet, is that he may have had a different vocation. We'll get into those in just a little bit, but he's a person from a place called Meresheth, and then in verse 14 of chapter 1, it's going to say Meresheth Gath. This is a place that we definitely know. Tommy was talking about it. It's southwest of Jerusalem, about 22 miles southwest of Jerusalem, 9 miles east of Gath. We have this kind of Meresheth Gath. There's a tale there. He was talking about Lachish, which is a place that we go on our trip to Israel. One of a neat little place. It's been closed since COVID, but you can still go there and look around at it. This place is just right next to it. There's a place called Tel El Judaida. I've never actually been there to see it, but it's there. It's nothing as significant and archaeologically standing than as Lachish, but that's kind of where he's at. What can we maybe deduce from, or let me ask this question. How are people in the Bible a lot of times referred to? Their name plus what? Or even if historically, if you understand. Tommy of where they come from, or what's another option? Their lineage. Their lineage. A lot of times it'll be, one of the most famous in the Old Testament, Joshua, son of Nun, right? But here, he's not referred to as part of his lineage. He's referred to as part of his place. I would suggest that this might be an indication that Micah was well known outside of his home village, that he was well known pretty good ways, because he's not just Micah. And if it's a lineage issue, if I say Tommy, son of Daniel Nordsmith, and Tommy's from New York, I don't have a clue who Daniel Nordsmith is, and it means nothing to me. But if Tommy has a good reputation, and this is the Tommy from New York, that makes a lot more sense. Does that make sense? Sometimes when you see attachments to location in the ancient world, sometimes it's an indication that they have prominence outside of their usual living space, their town or village.
His name was not Micah when he was born. How would they have known as a baby that he would be one who is like Yahweh at birth?
Yeah, why would they name him who is like Yahweh at birth? Is that an ascription to him, or is that an inscription, or is that a description of Micah, or would his parents have named him that based on their faith, not Micah's faith? A lot of times it would be the parents' faith. We would assume maybe that his parents were faithful people of God, that they would name their child who is like Yahweh. Meaning no one, right? The answer to that question is no one. And so it's possible. Go ahead. He's a nobody. Well, we're all nobodies, right? In that sense. We're all nobody. What's that song? I'm just a nobody. Trying to tell everybody, or tell everybody about, yeah, about somebody who saved my soul. It's a good song. So if he's never called a prophet, maybe he had a different vocation. Many suggest, just like with Amos, that maybe he was a farmer. And the suggestion comes from the fact that he references like farmer phrases, agrarian phrases at times. But does that necessarily mean that he was a farmer? And I think the same goes for Amos. I think Amos is more so, able to have that attachment than Micah. I have some references down here. Micah 1:6, 1:8, 3:12, 4:3, 7:1 as being locations where he has farming references. But does that necessarily mean that he is a farmer just because he uses that language? Or could it just be that he lives in that culture? And do we do the same thing in our culture? Do we have electronic references in our information world and culture we live in, but yet nobody in this room works in the computer space, right? Does that make sense?
The people he was talking to may have been like, they grew, millions or whatever.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Like people talk to money and they'll go to cow reference.
That's right. I can make references to cars because we all have cars. Doesn't mean I'm a mechanic. But he could reference, if I reference today, if I went out and even in Monroe, West Monroe, I don't even have to go to New York City and make agrarian references. Are they going to know, are they going to fully grasp what I'm saying? Probably not. A lot of people don't know where their food comes from these days. They don't know what it means to raise cattle. But back then, everybody understood, at least on some level. If they're not doing it themselves, they see their neighbor doing it. One suggestion, this comes from one of the main people that I've read so far on Micah is Wolf. He suggests that he was possibly an elder, that he had prominence as an elder in the town that he lived, and that's why he's given that association to the town. He gives 6 different reasons. He says that he's identified by the town and not his lineage. He's not addressed as a prophet. He speaks with great authority. So prophets speak with authority, but a person, if they just gave, I don't want to name anybody and make it sound like disparaging, but if you had a mild and timid person and God gave him a word to go give, that person's not naturally going to speak with authority, but Micah speaks with authority, and so there's a sense that he already had some type of authority. He's greatly concerned with justice, which would be something that an elder in a town would be concerned with. They sit at the gates, they make rulings on justice and legal matters. And his eldership would have offered him an audience in Jerusalem, possibly, that he would be able to have the authority to go and speak and people would recognize what he's saying. And then lastly, he says that many times he references, quote unquote, my people, which hints at some type of legal responsibility for the people of God, that this my people gave a sense that he's got some type of inherited need to care for those people beyond just saying, well, that's my neighbor. There's some issues with this theory. For example, nothing says that he would have authority outside of his town if he's an elder of a town. If I'm a city councilman in Monroe, Louisiana, and I go to Ruston, they don't really care that I'm a councilman in Monroe. It doesn't bear anything on the city of Ruston. And the other thing is that his message was for all of Israel. It wasn't just for his town. It wasn't just for Jerusalem. He actually speaks to all of Israel. There is a quote from Jeremiah that associates with Micah. It says that some of the elders of the land stood up and said to all the assembled people, Micah the Merashite prophesied in the days of King Hezekiah of Judah. And so there's somewhat of an insistence that if other elders knew of his words, then he may have been an elder as well. I'm not really sure. Any thoughts on what you think was Micah's vocation, or does it even matter? Don't think it matters. I think he may have been an age, and I think he had some type of authority. What that authority meant, I don't know. Even if we think of him just as a farmer, I would even say that if he was a farmer and that was his vocation before becoming a prophet, I would say he was probably a prolific farmer, a wealthy farmer, someone who didn't just have a garden for his family and a few cows for his family, that he was, selling and bartering where people knew him and came to him and something like that. So, well, yeah, I think that would be the case, that he's both. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, but he could have had both. And I think that's the kind of general consensus, no matter what we think his original vocation was, is that God called an ordinary person, someone who didn't have the vocation, say like Ezekiel, who was, or Jeremiah, someone, a priest who was a prophet, we could see that as a very high esteemed thing, that God only calls these great people. But when you have someone like Micah and someone like Amos, you see God calling the normal people in our societies to be his spokespeople. So when we think about his prophecy, and we'll talk about this more in depth, but he prophesied across what seems to be 63 years when we think about the kings that were there. We'll talk about that in detail and what that means. But the reason I list that is if his prophecy spans across many years, that goes to show that it would have been a somewhat of a dual vocation. I put in here, it may not have been his main vocation, but seems to have at least been a side hustle. That sounds bad. He's not making money off prophecy, but it was at least something that seems to coincide with his life and his dedication to God. When we talk about books and how we approach them, we need to date them. And I don't know if you remember, there were several things we talked about when we talk about dating a book, like how do we know its date? There were 3 areas that we talked about when it came to kind of factors for dating. Do y'all remember those? They would be the date of the person themselves, so the prophet. So when did Micah live? When did Jeremiah live? When did Isaiah live? And when were they given these prophecies? And the second factor is, what was the date of the prophecies themselves? So if a prophet lives for 75 years, can we try to deduce at what point in those years he actually prophesied? And then finally, when were the prophecies written down? And that's really what a lot of scholars are trying to more focus on. Me, I personally think that the message that was spoken and the message that was carried on and later written down is more important than understanding when it was written necessarily, but understanding when it was written is also very important, like we understood with Jonah. So when we studied Jonah, we understood that the time frame of when it was written helped us understand the book better. So those are the 3 factors. It could be that a prophet was born in an area, prophesied for a very small time, and his prophecies were written down 100 years later. And so that could mean something. We could understand that differently than if a prophet lived for a short period of time, prophesied his whole life, and he himself wrote down his prophecies in that time period. Those things have different understandings. The traditional view of the dating is that Micah proclaimed these prophecies during the reign of the 3 kings that were listed there. Micah chapter 1, verse 1 says, when he gave what he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. And so that's kind of the traditional view. There's the opposing view, which is a more critical and some would say more liberal view, would be that, well, this was written just way later after the exile, and Micah never said these words or wrote them down. And then you have everything in between. Me personally, I'm more conservative. I side on the side that these prophets actually spoke these words, and that if they weren't written down by them, they were written down very shortly afterwards by people who heard the prophecies, who were first-hand witnesses, just like we see with the Gospels. When it comes to the date of Micah as a prophet, we have these 3 kings. So I'm not sure, did anybody chart out when these kings were king? Tommy did. What you got? So Jotham.
Jotham was from 739 to 731 BC. Ahaz 31 to 715 BC. Hezekiah 715 to 686 BC.
That's
They could have prophesied the last year of Jotham, and then up to the first year of Hezekiah, or even to the last. But predicted here, it's good near that it's probably around 735 to 710 BC.
735 to 710. Yeah, so those are kind of like some concise dates. Wherever you look those up, they try to say, well, this king stopped reigning and this king began reigning. It's a little fluid in there. So the whole period you have of possibilities from 750 to 686. And then within those, you kind of have some fluidity between the reigns where there's some co-reign and stuff like that. But when we look at the whole of what I referenced earlier, Jeremiah 26:18, it says Micah the Merashite prophesied in the days of King Hezekiah of Judah. So that's actually giving us an outside source. Now people would say, well, that's still in the Bible. That can't be an outside source. That's a different scroll written at a different time, testifying to when Micah wrote, right? So he wrote in the days of King Hezekiah of Judah, and he said to all the people, now what does he say? He says, this is what the Lord of armies says, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become like ruins, and the temple's mountain will be a high thicket. And we see these references, these things that Jeremiah says, Micah says. We find them in Micah 3:12 and a little bit of Micah 4:1. But it places at least that during the time of Hezekiah, right? And these 3 kings are what we see when I reference 63 years. That's what I'm referencing as the span of the king's reign. So you can go all the way from 750 to 686. and it's somewhere in there, but Tommy beat me to the punch here when he said, doesn't have to be 63 years, right? It could be from the end of Jotham's reign, say the last year of Jotham's reign, to the first year of Hezekiah's reign. And depending on how you put those dates, we could be as small as 2 years apart. If Hezekiah starts in 729 and kind of overlaps Ahaz a bit, and Jotham ends in 731, you got as small as 2 years apart. So it really doesn't help us as far as getting down and trying to get the date really locked in or anything like that. There's no data on how long Micah lived either. So if we knew that Micah lived a certain age, say Micah dies in 705, well, now we can eliminate all the way to 686, right? And if we knew his actual age, we could say, well, he wasn't prophesying at the age of 15, so we could bring the date up a little bit. We don't know those things. Basically, all we can say is what we've just attested, that between these three kings at some point, up to 63 years of prophecy, all the way down to 2 years of prophecy, Micah was a prophet. All of Ahaz, so he's covering all of Ahaz, which I think is part of the problem, right? He's covering the reign of Ahaz. We'll talk about the kings in a minute, but Ahaz, right in the middle of Jotham and Hezekiah, is a pretty bad king. He's not doing what's right, and he's leading the people astray, which brings about the prophecy, brings about the judgment of God towards Israel. So when we think about the dates of the prophecies themselves, many critics argue that the date and the authenticity of the oracles not belonging to Micah, like I said, it comes later on, that it's just attributed to Micah. I don't really agree with that. Micah is full of detail. We'll see as we go through. It has all kinds of detail. It lists everything. The thing it lacks is historical detail. It doesn't have a lot of historical detail like Jeremiah does or Isaiah does. Some scholars are really not okay with a lot of unknowns. Modern scholars really want to dig into the weeds. I think it's good, but sometimes it comes to the point of a fault. If we're if we're not okay with the unknowns, we can kind of get away from what was intended, if that makes sense. So scholars will dig in and they'll say, well, we don't really know where these two chapters, there's no historical data that attaches them to a specific time during these three kings, so maybe these two chapters were written and added later. That's really kind of getting in the weeds of scholarship, but this is really a modern issue. The ancient world wasn't really concerned about the exact date of Micah's life, or they would be more concerned, okay, this is a message that came about during the reign of these three kings. And what was Israel supposed to learn from it at that time, and what can we learn from it now? That's really how it goes. But because in the end, absence of historical data from a section of a text doesn't mean it's removed from the person it's attributed to. Does that make sense? There's two places. We already mentioned one, and I'll list it. I'll just kind of talk about it in detail, but there's two places that have specific dates to, or I would say two oracles, these prophetic oracles. There's multiple ones throughout. And so there's two oracles that have, what do I mean by an oracle? Because I'm making a lot of assumptions that people know. So an oracle is one unified message. So it'll be like, when we start, the first one's Micah 1, 2 through 16, basically the first chapter of Micah. So he's going to have some collective prophecies or oracles that are given to Israel, and those are unified through structure and theme. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then he's going to move on in chapter 2 to something else that has a new unified structure and theme. Does that make sense? So it's like we do chapters and verses in our Bibles, but when it came to prophecies, here's an oracle. Okay, now I'm going to speak something else, if that makes sense. So I don't want the word oracle because I've said that. That's just, I don't want that to get lost in translation there. So the two that have specific dates are basically the first chapter of Micah. It's not the first verse. That's a superscription, but it's the first chapter of Micah. Starts off right there saying who Micah is, and we call that a superscription. It's just telling us who is the author or who's the prophet. And then it goes into the oracle in verse 2. And we can date this from verse 6 if you have your Bibles open. Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the countryside, a planting area for a vineyard. I will roll her stones into the valley and expose her foundations. So anyone know looked into the background? Anybody know when was Samaria, or we could say the northern tribes, when were they totally destroyed like this? 722. So the year 722 BCE, the northern tribes fall to the Assyrians. And this is kind of what we say, they're taken into captivity. They never come back. That's not like wholly accurate, but generally speaking, the tribes are taken by Assyria in 722. So what does that help us? How does that help us? If the prophecy is about Samaria becoming ruins like he expresses, what does that tell us about that prophecy and its date? It validates the date. So it tells us just on the most simple form that prophecy came before 722. If he's prophesying, we understand him to be a prophet. He's talking about when Samaria fell in 722, so this had to have been spoken before 722. It fits like you said, it fits the period of the kings that have already been spoken. The second one is one that we've already mentioned, Micah 3. And it really is like the chapter of Micah 3. I said a while ago, parts, like half of verse 1 of chapter 4 is also connected there. But Micah 3:12 says, "Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become ruins, and the temple's mountain will be a high thicket." So when was Jerusalem destroyed like Samaria? 705 was the first destruction. But there's actually 3 destructions, really. Jerusalem went down in stages. And so, you said 70 AD. No, in this time frame, the first destruction of Jerusalem would have been 705 BCE. And the last destruction of Jerusalem would have been 686. All of this prophecy is in preparation for the exile. So if we understood that 705, 686, at the very least, it has to be before when? 686. So that kind of helps keep those time frames within that. The 2 portions that give us specific times, keep those time frames within where it says that he prophesied. Hezekiah 729 to 686 is the one place that it's said that it is attributed to a writing during that time period, and that's really where it falls. And you can go back to Ahaz before, if Hezekiah is 729 to 686, the fall of Jerusalem, and the other one was 722, that fits right there with all 3 kings. And it doesn't really matter when it ended. It just had to end before 686, had to be before 722. Any questions on dating? It's kind of the nerdy stuff, but we'll get to the chapter next week. What's the setting? I mean, we kind of talked about it a little bit. Assyria is going to come in and wipe out the northern tribe. Who's coming in to take out the southern tribes? Or Judah. Babylon's coming. But there's mention of both the northern and southern tribes. He focuses on Judah. That's where he resides, right? He's in south of Jerusalem, so he references the 3 kings there. Israel, while Judah has these 3 kings, contemporary to that, there's 4 kings for Israel at the same time period. Menachem, Pekah, and Hoshea. Sorry, I had my notes weird. So those 4 kings. Any of those sound familiar to anybody? I mean, you probably heard the names, but there's one that may stick out. He's kind of referenced as the worst king of all of Israel, depending on how you rate them. But Menachem, or Menahem, is Menachem, Pekah, and Hoshea. Menachem is really a really bad king. So the difference here you have between the north and the south is, at the time that this is being written by Micah, Judah, or Judea, is witnessing complete and utter chaos that's going on in the north. They're seeing them act just total fools. They're seeing them being destroyed by Assyria at some point in the middle of Micah's ministry. And there's relative peace, not peace, but there's not nearly as much chaos in the south. And so they're witnessing these things, and essentially he's saying, that's going to happen to you if y'all don't get your act together. But when we talk about the setting of all of Israel, we have in the northern tribes, or northern Israel, it's really just bad king after bad king. And then you have exile. bad king after bad king, and then you have exile. But Menachem, this king who's, I've just quoted these 9 verses, he only gets 9 verses, but they're 9 really bad verses. So 2 Kings 15, 13 through 22, I'll just read this passage to give you an idea of how this king was acting. It says, in the 39th year of Judah's king Uzziah, so he's giving you even a correlation to the north and southern kings at the same time here in 2 Kings. In the 39th year of Judah's king Uzziah, Shallum son of Jobesh became king. He reigned in Samaria a full month. Then Menachem son of Gadi came up from Tirzah to Samaria and struck down Shallum son of Jabesh there. He killed him and became king in his place. As for the rest of the events of Shallum's reign, along with the conspiracy that he formed, they are written in the historical record of Israel's king. At that time, starting from Tirzah, Menachem attacked Tifsah and all who were in it and its territory because they wouldn't surrender. He ripped open all the pregnant women. In the 39th year of Judah's king Azariah, Menachem son of Gadi became king over Israel, and he reigned 10 years in Samaria. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Throughout his reign, he did not turn away from the sins Jeroboam son of Nebat had caused Israel to commit. King Pul of Assyria invaded the land, so Menachem gave Pul 75,000 pounds of silver so that Pul would support him and strengthen his grasp on the kingdom. Then Menachem exacted 20 ounces of silver from each of the prominent men of Israel to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria withdrew and didn't stay there in the land. The rest of the events of Menachem's reign, along with his accomplishments, are written in the historical record. So he caused people to sin. He ripped open he killed pregnant women. He killed children. He allowed Assyria to take all the money, and just a really bad king. He did everything that was basically against what our God's character is. And in contrast, you have Judah, who had 2 good kings sandwiched around a bad king. And just to give you a short background of each one of these kings during the time of Micah, Jotham reigned with his father Uzziah for a little bit until his father died, and then he goes on and reigns as king. And in direct opposition to what we heard about Menachem, who said he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, 2 Kings says that Jotham did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So he's a good king. He's not perfect. Namely, he allowed them to keep their high places. Do we know what high places are? What's a high place? Places of worship to really other gods. And so he allowed those. He didn't destroy them like he was supposed to, but it still says that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So he was liberal in the things like worship, but he was still a good king. And then Ahaz comes, and it says that he did much, much evil. I would read, if you want some homework, 2 Kings chapter 16 to read about Ahaz's evil. He does a lot of the same stuff Menachem does, not quite as bad, but southern part. Yeah, this is Micah's 3 kings that he's prophesying in the midst of. So Ahaz is right in the middle, and Ahaz is the one that's really bad king. So it says stuff like he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, the very places that weren't destroyed before him. What else? I had the whole chapter here. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, his God, like his ancestor David. So he's actually compared as an antithesis to David. Hezekiah comes next. He's the third king for Micah, and this is the king that's going to go really into the exile. But he does good, and he actually goes beyond what Jotham did in his reforms, and he gets rid of all these high places. But really, it's kind of a day late and a dollar short for Israel at this time. They're going to feel the punishment. But he even called on Israel at his time. Hezekiah calls to Israel and asks them to repent, the king in the south. He showed great trust in the midst of conflict. Whenever there were issues that seemed to threaten him, he stayed firm. And he became haughty at one point, but then he later humbled himself. So those are kind of the kings that are in place all over Israel during this time of Micah. When it came to kind of the bigger area, there were conflicts everywhere. I mean, this is the time where both north and south have sinned throughout their history, and they're getting attacked because of it. Judah was economically strong at this time. Assyria wasn't. the northern tribes weren't. They gave a lot of money, like we saw, to Assyria. But Judah still suffered a lot of blows under Ahaz. So when Ahaz is king, the northern tribes come down and kill, it says 120,000 of their men. So they suffer that. They're attacked by the Edomites and the Philistines because they're kind of closer to that southern kingdom. And they ask for help from Assyria, kind of like what the northern tribes did. Tiglath-Pileser comes in and he basically just oppresses them and doesn't give them any help and leaves. He takes their money and runs. There was turmoil for both places, but it was much greater in the north at this time. So who's the audience? We talked about this a while ago. Who's the audience of Micah? Samaria and Jerusalem, the north and the south. Mostly the south? Okay.
Mostly the south, for the most part.
Why do you say that?
Yes, because he was part of the south.
He was part of the south? I think so. He doesn't, one thing that people mention or note that it says that he mentions Samaria and Jerusalem, but he doesn't mention any Israelite kings. He mentions the Judean kings. Why do you think that is? I think part of it would be what Tommy said. This is his area, but also what would be some theological implications at that time for him to only mention those kings? He knew they wouldn't hear what they had to say? What else? Maybe he only mentions them because, remember, where was God's capital? Where was his house supposed to reside? In Jerusalem. And what did the northern tribes do? They went, created their own nation. They tried to worship somewhere else. So essentially, we could deduce that he's actually given authority to the proper kings, if that makes sense, proper kings over Israel. He's given a prophecy to everybody, the north and the south, and he's mentioning just those kings, maybe because the whole nation was supposed to be ruled from Jerusalem. It wasn't supposed to be divided at that time. That's a possibility. I kind of like that thought. It could be an authorial thing, like he's only given authority to the kings that are reigning from Judea. Many of the oracles, however, address sins of both the north and the south, and so that's kind of where I think traditionally, or even when I first started my study on Micah, I thought, well, this is a prophet to the southern tribes, but he says he prophesies to the whole nation, and a lot of the sins are sins of both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and I kind of came to the point where he's prophesying to the whole nation, and he only lists those kings because those are the kings he gives authority to. I think his prophecies are almost like a unification of what's supposed to be, if that makes sense. Just as a general rule, when I think about this, and I wouldn't separate them in Micah, I wouldn't separate his judgments to different areas unless he says so. And those would be the two places that we mentioned, right? Chapter 1 mentions Samaria specifically, and chapter 3 mentions Jerusalem specifically. And I think he's specific in those instances, but I would suggest that maybe the rest of it is something for the whole nation, all of Israel. Yeah. What are some, if you've read Micah before, what are some theological points that you could think of that Micah's making? Well, let me ask this. What are the usual general theological points that every prophet makes?
Do this and you'll be blessed. Don't do it, you be cursed.
Yeah, turn back to God, obey him, and you'll be blessed. Repent, yep. Don't do it and you'll be judged. That's really what the whole point is for all of the prophets is judgment's coming. There are bad things and consequences to your actions that are on their way. And you may even suffer those actions, those consequences of your actions, but there's hope for the future, right? And that's a key component for really all of the prophets. And it's no different here. No different here. Specifically with Micah in the context of that general prophetic context, theological context. Here he has said that Israel and Judah have been unfaithful to the covenants. He's real heavy on the covenant of God with the nation of Israel. People refer to that as the Mosaic covenant at this point, right? He's real big on, here's the covenant that God made with you when he brought you out of Egypt. And here's what you've done with it. And so he's saying, you've been unfaithful to the covenant. But he doesn't just curse them and say they've been unfaithful to the covenant. He says, in contrast, Yahweh has been overwhelmingly faithful. And so you've been so unfaithful, but look at God. He is always faithful. Because they were unfaithful, there's these covenant curses that are coming. But theologically, because God is overwhelmingly faithful, blessings and hope still remain in your future. And so that's somewhat the way it's built here in Micah is unique in that instance. One thing that really needs to be understood, and I know here with us, understanding the covenant that Israel had with God at that time, the covenant that's being referenced, fully understanding that helps us understand Micah a whole lot better. So you'll see as we go through, he's going to reference things that as we've read the Exodus story year after year, as we've read Deuteronomy year after year, Leviticus year after year, knowing those things help us understand Micah so much better. And really, that for us, that would seem like obvious, right? Well, of course, we always teach read the Bible from the beginning. But it's not so obvious for everybody, and it's really important for this. There's other prophets where it's not as important. I would even say we just got through with Jonah. You don't really have to know a whole bunch about the covenant God made with Israel when they came out of Exodus to understand Jonah. He doesn't focus on that like he does in Micah. But here, that's one big point, that understanding that covenant would be tantamount to understanding Micah. So there's four things theologically, four kind of sections within this theological perspective that he highlights: covenant unfaithfulness, justice, judgment, and future restoration. And so we kind of understand what covenant unfaithfulness is. The northern and southern tribes have sinned against God. Really what he points out is, you've sinned against your neighbors, you've done these horrible things against each other, but really, that in itself is a sin against God. So a lot of times in Israel and their nation, they would treat each other harshly, and they would not treat each other the way they were supposed to be, and think, well, I can treat you bad, but as long as I do to God what he deserves, right? I can come over here and curse you out and hit you and beat you and steal from you, but I can go to the temple and offer a sacrifice and do what God wants, and I'm good. God says, no. That's not what's intended, right? That's not what is intended. What's intended is that you don't sin against your man, because doing so is sinning against me. There are specific sins listed in Micah, but without even going through it yet, do you think that the specific sins listed in Micah are the only sins that they committed? Probably not. And if you go across multiple contemporary prophets, they're all going to list different sins, right? So what's the point? It's not the sin specifically that they're wanting to target. They're not saying, well, you've stolen from your brother, so just get the stealing aspect of obedience under control and you'll be good. No, it's God's concerned with the heart behind it. Why do you want to disobey? Why do you want to sin? Why do you want to do the things that are against me? Micah, at one point, the most famous verse in Micah chapter 6, says that question, like, well, what does God want? God's answer isn't perfect obedience. His answer was a changed heart. His answer was a heart that wants to obey. Israelites were utterly unfaithful, while Yahweh was utterly faithful. And I think that's, if I could sum it up in one statement of what his judgment is against. They could have just, been cursed and punished immediately, but what does God do? He gives them time to get themselves together. There's grace in that, right? Justice. What is justice? What is justice? We see justice and righteousness in Scripture. Two different things, similar. Justice is what we would think of as justice today in our nation, right? To deny justice to anyone is egregious to Yahweh. That's his thing. Brueggemann, one of the scholars that I was kind of reading through on Micah a little bit, he says, it wasn't even Micah, I think it was Deuteronomy or something. he says that justice is sorting out what belongs to whom and returning it to them if it's taken away. Now, that encompasses a lot of stuff. Is that just things? Does that mean that if someone steals from you, if Tommy comes and takes your car, I just make sure that Tommy gives your car back? Or could that include things that aren't even tangible? If Tommy has spoiled your reputation in the community, can I help you get that back? Different things like that. So in a most simplistic form, I liked what Brueggemann said, sorting out what belongs to whom and returning it to them if it's taken. Justice includes social entitlements. That's not talking about in America today, not getting political, but what establishes social boundaries? That's what I mean by that. Social entitlements for Israel is social boundaries like land, right? I have my property and you can't take that from me. Cancellation of debts. So a person can regain their respect, power, and dignity within a community. Something that when you hear social justice or social entitlements in America, they're definitely not concerned with canceling debts. Redistribution of land. What do I mean by that? Like redistribution of land. You understand what I'm saying? After a jubilee, if Tommy has acquired a lot of land, or his family really has acquired so much land from another tribe, at the jubilee it all goes back to who it originally belonged to, redistributing it back to what it belongs. There's no land monopolies, for instance. There's no way that someone could become a billionaire and buy up the entire nation of Israel. When it comes to justice, social justice, civil justice, religious justice, Israel was guilty of all fronts when it comes to their judgment here. Judgment, that's 3 of the 4 theological points. Judgment. Accusations and judgments are based on the Mosaic covenant, real specifically in Micah. In other prophets, sometimes it's like hinted at, but here he's calling on Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and curses. He's calling on that to bring them to court. The curses of judgment reaffirm that covenant, right? When he's bringing up those curses, he's not just bringing them up saying, well, you remember when God said he's going to curse you? He's bringing them up to say, do you remember the covenant that God made with you when he redeemed you out of Egypt? That's the whole point. I think that maybe a modern understanding of Yahweh and the Bible is that God got so angry and furious, he just lashed out against Israel. No, he gave them what he said they would deserve so that they would return to him, not so that they would run away or not want to be with him. And then there's future restoration. In a nutshell, Micah talks about future restoration and hope in a broader sense. This isn't just a hope that God's going to maintain his covenant with you. It's more broad than that. He's going to give you land. He's going to give you a ruler. This ruler is called a king only one time in the book of Micah. He's never called the Messiah, but when we look at all of the ways that Micah talks about this ruler that's coming, it's purely messianic. And he talks about the future judgment of nations who would come after and harm Israel. Basically, Babylon and Assyria, they're going to take them captive, and there's going to be a future where they're going to be destroyed because of that. We see that kind of in Ezekiel really takes that on. Ezekiel has like several chapters of curses against other nations. It's really unique for Ezekiel. Lastly, I'll talk about the genre, the kind of makeup, the literary makeup of Micah. So what is Micah in a general sense? What kind of literary genre is it throughout the whole book? When you look at it, what does it look like? Yeah, it's poetry. Exactly, yeah. So Micah is what we call like traditional Hebrew poetry. It uses parallelisms a lot. Anybody know what a parallelism is? Say that 5 times fast. So one that everybody knows comes from the Psalms. May your word be a light unto my feet and a lamp unto my path. Is that a statement saying we want a light and a lamp for my feet and the path? Or is it just emphasizing how great God's light is to guide us on our journey, right? So that's a parallelism. They're put together, and we call those it's a rhyming of ideas, this rhyming of ideas. So they mean the same thing, and they're said poetically next to each other. So a lamp unto my feet is the same thing as a light unto the path. They both are doing the same thing. They're both God directing our steps. The Hebrew poetry here is also combined with several aspects that I think are important to understand for the layout of the book: covenant lawsuit, woes, and hope. So what is a covenant lawsuit? What do we think if you hear that phrase, covenant lawsuit? Getting sued because you broke the covenant. That's pretty good. So it's bringing a case against a people who has a covenant. So I think it's Deuteronomy, right? God says, when you go and you break the covenant, I'm going to make heaven and earth stand as a witness against you. Anybody remember that verse? What does that mean, to make heaven and earth stand against you? Pay for your sins? How? I think part of that is saying this is a covenant with creation of what he's doing, but also, how does he... Well, let me give you another one. He says, I'm going to cause the land to... Your sin will cause the land to spew you out, to vomit you out. So God says, like, what's a common curse in Israel or the ancient world? Drought, right? They didn't have irrigation. So when drought comes, the earth is bearing witness against the sins of Israel. Right? Does that make sense? To bear witness against them. That's a very tangible way that it happens, but he sets this up in Deuteronomy, and then later, like in Micah and other places, he actually words things as if he's bringing Israel into court and standing and making them stand there before God. And so that's kind of what you have here. A covenant lawsuit is God. It's a usual pattern outside of Israel in the ancient world, but for the Bible, it's God bringing the people that were part of the covenant. It's not God, right? Because God never breaks his covenants. He brings Israel before him in a courtroom and says, here's what's happened. Here's your sentence. That's basically what a covenant lawsuit is. It has some linguistic patterns that I'm not going to get into details, like very technical Hebrew language stuff, but what everyone can understand is a thematic pattern that we see every time with these covenant lawsuits. It's a call for the accused to hear the judgment. So you can't have a court case if the accused is not there to hear what the accusations are against them. This is an age-old thing. And so there's a call for them to hear the judgment against them. There's a list of transgressions. Here's how you've sinned. And for the covenant here, covenant lawsuits in the Bible, there's a list of the ways that Yahweh didn't transgress. And then there's the rulings and the sentence that's required because of it. So to have a direct relationship with God is, in this sense, Micah's focused on this covenant. I know that Tommy probably has heard of this phrase, maybe not some others. Suzerain vassal treaty. Anybody ever heard that? Say that 5 times fast too. Suzerain vassal treaty, and I don't want to go into it. We're almost out of time, but I don't want to go into it in depth. But in the ancient world, you would have a little nation and a big nation. And the little nation needs help, so they ask the big nation for help, and the king says, I'll help you, I'll be your ally, I'll keep the bullies away, but you're going to pay. You're going to give me some money. I'm going to get your crops. I'm going to get all of this. But in return, I'm going to make sure all your people are safe and nobody attacks you. When you look at the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of this Torah covenant, Deuteronomy is written in the format of a suzerain vassal treaty of the ancient world. Almost, I mean, you can, line for line, take it and line it up. It always starts with an introduction of how great the king is of the foreign nation. That's, you always had to laud them with praises at the beginning of this covenant. Here's what this great king has done for us so far. Here's what we're committing to do. Here's what will happen if we don't hold up our end of the bargain, blessings and curses. Right? That's the general sense. And so these are tied to this. The covenant lawsuits are chapters 1, 3, and 6. So if you're following the pattern, we'll follow it as we go. 1, 3, and 6. The other one is woe oracles. What do you think signifies a woe oracle? Like W-O-E. A woe oracle. Bad things are coming, yeah. It starts with woe is me, yeah. So like that general sense would tell you that's a woe oracle. Micah makes it easy. He starts them with the word woe. So look at Micah 2 verse 1. Woe to those who dream up wickedness and prepare evil plans on their beds. He starts with woe. Micah 7:1. Now my translation, CSB, says, how sad for me, for I'm like one who, and he goes on and does all these things. How sad for me. Except for in Hebrew it says, woe is me. That's what it says, woe is me. After the woes, it continues to talk about, so it'll say, woe is, here, woe to those who dream up wickedness. And then it'll go on to talk about the current situation that's bringing all these woes. Does that make sense? So you currently are feeling some pain. Woe to you who are feeling the pain. And this is why you're feeling it. Your current situation is causing this pain from this. So like chapter 2, woe to those who dream up wickedness. Why do you feel pain right now? Why are your people feeling like they are not blessed? Well, it's because you have people who are dreaming up wickedness. They're preparing evil plans on their beds. They're conniving against each other. They're not doing what's right. So there's 2 woe oracles, chapters 2 and 7. So we start to see a pattern, 1, 3, and 6, chapters 2 and 7. They kind of flow. And then we have what we call a hope oracle. Now, sometimes these are called salvation oracles. I don't really use that word salvation here because it kind of gets confused for eternal salvation type thing. Hope is more broad than like salvation. It's just like general hope for the future. It's really broad. It's not just a return to the covenant of God. It's in the sense of like we talked about earlier, the three things: the promise of coming back to the land, of having a ruler, of ruling over your enemies. It's more than just like, well, God's going to maintain his covenant. So there's 3 hope oracles. You find those chapter 2 verses 12 and 13, chapter 4 1 through 5, and then chapter 7 7 through 20. And so all of these kind of relate to the structure that we have. We have kind of a general structure with Micah as well. There's 3 big divisions. So you can say chapters 1 and 2, 3 through 5, and 6 and 7. I'm going to read the first line of each of these sections, and you tell me what you hear that marks them as beginning, or that would mark them as the beginning of something, a section. So Micah 1:2 says, listen, all you peoples, pay attention, earth and everyone in it. Chapter 3:1 says, then I said, now listen, leaders of Jacob, you rulers in the house of Israel. And Micah 6:1 says, now listen to what the Lord is saying. All starts with listen, that's right. What's the Hebrew word for listen? We should know this, right? We say it every week. Shema. Hear. Listen. Hear and respond, hear and obey. So they all begin with Shema, but they don't just all, this is not just even one thing. It's not just like, well, we can see the word hear and that will give us a section. They also all begin with Shema followed by judgment, these judgments that are coming against Israel, and they all end with hope. So you kind of have these 3 sections of judgment and hope, and the hope is unique here in Micah, that every one of these hopes end with this image of a good shepherd, a shepherding image, this agrarian image of shepherding. And then within these 3 sections too, you kind of see like a unified theme. So the first section, 1 and 2, Israel faces exile due to their sin and breaking the covenant, but a remnant will be gathered and it will survive. The second section, 3 and 5, says the wealthy people are judged for oppressing the poor, but there's a time where Israel will be exalted and the remnant will thrive. And then chapter 6 and 7, a remnant of Israel will receive forgiveness and triumph over sin. Some people would say that there's like 2 parts, 3 parts, all that stuff. I would stick with these 3 parts, and then I would even add what Hoyt does. Hoyt is the one that kind of where I got this. There's a scholar named Hoyt, female. She writes on Micah. She's the one who points out covenant, lawsuit, woe, and hope. Well, within each one of these 3 structures, it's not just starting with judgment and ending with hope. It's specifically that covenant, lawsuit, the woe, and hope throughout those 3 there. So that kind of gives us our structure for it, and our genre is all kind of wrapped into it. So we have Micah, this prophet who's not named a prophet, but he speaks on the behalf of God. During the time of Hezekiah, Ahaz, and Jotham, he's given prophecies to all of Israel, and it's in the form of Hebrew poetry all the way throughout. All 7 chapters of Hebrew poetry that include these covenant lawsuits, woes, and a message of hope. Excuse me. Tommy, did I miss anything? You got anything to add to some background information to Micah?
That, a little bit, it really doesn't mean a whole lot other than I just think it's kind of what I would call a God wink.
Okay.
It's 33rd book of the Bible.
33rd book of the Bible.
And
Okay.
33 books follow behind it. It just reminds me of Messiah's 33 years. I don't know if there's
Oh, yeah. So 33 book of our English Bibles, and then 33 out of the 66 books. Okay. That's interesting. That's really interesting. Do I think Micah wrote it? Yeah. And so here's where I kind of rest with most of the prophets. Because there's a difference between the prophet who was called to speak and then the writing down of the things that he did speak. I'm okay with, because if we look at chapter 1, verse 1, and it says, where'd it go? Which he saw, but yeah, it's a superscription that attributes the prophecies to Micah. Same thing with the Psalms. You ever go through the Psalms and it'll say a Psalm of David. Psalm 90 says a Psalm of Moses. Those weren't written at the top of those weren't really in the original manuscripts, right? They're in the manuscripts. Let me get this right. No one thinks that was original to the Psalm, that when they compiled these songs together that they said, okay, this was one from David, this was one from Moses. So here, it seems as if, along with the other prophets, much of the other prophets, that somebody wrote down what the prophet said. Now, that could be, take Jeremiah, for example. Jeremiah had a scribe named Baruch. Jeremiah spoke. Jeremiah probably knew how to write, but he had a scribe. So, did the scribe write down what he said? Did Jeremiah tell the scribe what to write down? It's kind of loose in there. Here's where when it comes to like divine inspiration, God divinely inspired the people to write it. And when you say, well, that author's, we don't really know if Jeremiah wrote Jeremiah, and people get upset and they're like, well, he had to have written it. So God can only inspire Jeremiah and no one else in his time. And so I think that the whole process of the Bible coming to us as we have today, that includes the people that he spoke through, the people who wrote down the words of those who spoke, the people who compiled them together, the people who added notes along the way. All of those are inspired beings that came about. So, but when it comes to pride, to get back to your question, it's a long way around to answer your question. I would say Micah or some of Micah's scribes or counterparts, someone close to him that knew him and knew the words that he spoke, one of those two. I think that it would have been written very soon during Micah's time, as a warning. What else? Anything else? I get excited about this information. I know it can be boring for some, but I think it's vitally important to understand all the background information to the books we read and understand their place. What's up? So that's a great question. Were the 3 sections that I outlined, could they have been written at different times and compiled together? That's a whole other section. I was going to put a section on the unity of the text, but sometimes I just don't want to get too into the technical areas that I'm comfortable with, but not everybody is. But that would be what a lot of critics say. A lot of critics will take books, every book of the Bible, and they'll nitpick. They'll say, well, we can tell that this was written during the time of Hezekiah, so yeah, that's probably Micah. But this other one, that's probably somebody, 100 years later. I'm very cautious against that. I don't think, like Jonah, take for example Jonah. You have a chapter of prose. You have this poetry in chapter 2, and then 2 more chapters of prose. There are critics who will say, well, chapter 2 was added in way later. I'm not against that. I'm not saying that God couldn't do that. But why does that have to be the case? Why can't Jonah write? Why can't the author of the book of Jonah write a book? And I think theologically it was poetic in the middle. I think that was an intentional theological part of Jonah where it's intended to make a theological point, that poetry is there. So why can't that be the case, Why do we have to say that the only things attributed to Micah is chapter 1 and 3, because they specifically mention Samaria and Jerusalem and nowhere else. There's nothing that says that, you know. And then if we do that, so if we say, well, that portion that mentions Samaria has to be before 722, the portion of Jerusalem has to be before 686. That's all during the time of Micah. Well, now I've just said that the first two big sections, because I connect the sections according to theme and to structure. So I can't separate where he talks about Samaria in chapter 1, verse 6, from chapter 2, verse 14, because structurally they're all together. You see what I'm saying? So then if I do that, then I'm left with the last section that I might could attribute to someone else. The only book that I really would kind of say that's probably so would be the book of Isaiah. Isaiah's book spans hundreds of years. There's a lot to Isaiah, yeah. And so that's the only book that I kind of say, well, 66 chapters in Isaiah, yeah. And so, but with Micah, I don't see it. I mean, I've been going through it. I've translated the whole book, studied it for the past year. I don't see any reason to think that it was chopped up and added to over the years. Great question, though. Great question. Anything else? All right, so next week we're diving into chapter 1. Everybody's going to read chapter 1 ahead of time. That's right. And so we'll dig into chapter 1. And so hopefully, I mean, I don't want to limit us, but I would hope to say that we'll spend we'll do a chapter every week. I want Micah to be kind of an 8-week thing, 7 chapters. We did an introduction tonight, and then 7 weeks of the book itself. So if everybody comes and we just kind of discuss, and we'll read through a chapter, discuss it for an hour or hour and 50 minutes, whatever, and kind of go from there. All right, we'll pray as we end. Father, we come before you. We thank you for today. We thank you for this place that we're able to meet together communally and study your word. We thank you for your word that's been given and handed down to us over time. And we thank you for the ability and the freedom to study it, to learn from it, and to apply it so that others would see your character through us as we exemplify your character that's given to us in the word. We ask that your Spirit continue to guide us, direct us, that your word would be a lamp unto our path and a light unto our feet, and that we would shine your light in the communities of darkness all around us continuously so that others may come to know you and to love you and to be with you forever. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen. Amen.
I was just thinking of, in poetry, how you write and you stop the train of thought.
Oh, I know you're talking about, actually.
Boys live in, I think it's.
Oh, yeah, it is. There's some,
Y'all went to Hibbets to come in town sometime and visit.
their mom still lives out there.
Mary?
Well, Mary's,
Yeah, Mary's the sister-in-law.
Mary's sister-in-law.
But
Her
is that-
brother-in-law, her brother-in-law and sister-in-law come here. They live in Mississippi, he's a doctor, and they come to town, they'll come here to church, or they come to Socoke.
I know Mary.
Oh, you know Mary, her parent, her in-laws live out there on, Cables, right off Cables. Or, no, they live on Howard Brown.